So I would like to engage you in a little conversation and to solicit your sharing your experiences and also providing your advice. So I'm going to start with two questions. The first one is to share with us how you start when you start engaging with young people. How do you get their attention? How do you get them on board? How do you capture their enthusiasm? I have been fortunate to be with you in meetings in Nairobi, where I see you're a very dynamic personality. I think your personality helps a lot in getting
Thank
people
you.
on board and making it fun. But what are the lessons in how do you capture the first instance of interest and then harvest that and then build on that? And then the second question related to that, I know you're doing this in many countries in Africa. Once you've done it in one country, how do you then take the lessons to the other country? How can you, as you said, evidence-based information, knowledge sharing, we did it here, it was successful. Why don't you think about doing it? How have you been able to do that? And maybe share a few experiences from your own, your vast experience, a few anecdotes of how you did this. I think that would be very interesting for our audience. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Salim. I think those are very critical, important questions that I think lays not just the foundation and basis on how we can leverage on this huge human capital and sovereign capital that we need, which is what modern finance to bring locally led adaptation to scale. On the first question, the reality is that the young people, most of them don't really bother about climate change per se. Yes, they know that the impacts have been, they see the impacts every day, whether through droughts or floods that have been manifested where they are. Their immediate consideration is the one jobs, especially those who have jobs, the one actually employment. And that then means that the narrative of engaging them on climate adaptation or climate action cannot be the same as we pitch to governments or decision makers. It must be from the dimension of socioeconomic opportunity, what is in it for them. And what we have successfully done is that to engage individually is very difficult. So ecosystem-based adaptive security assembly, tech savvy can also be engaged. And as a result of that framework, we created a tool within it, which is called an innovative volunteerism tool. Where leveraging on that, I had to start giving talks to using through universities, especially University of Nairobi here, and any country where I went to do work or to monitor a project, I seized the opportunity to use academic institution to actually explain what is in it in adaptation or climate action for the youth that can help them create opportunities for themselves and make money as they solve community problems. As a result of that, they started registering. And what we noticed across the continent was that most of these youth are actually in their individual capacity doing some excellent work. We see them turning waste to briquettes. We see them turning waste to biofertilizer. We saw them manufacture, using local instruments to be able to put up solar dryers that are helping farmers dry. But there was never a way in which they can be connected with one another. So what we did was then we brought them to the fore to then be like the champions and engage them to train the other youth who have willingly registered to become not only innovative volunteerism actors, but who had also shown some passion. And that way now we then constituted a pool and then they became early adopters and now they are trainer of trainers. And I think that then takes me to your second question on how then did we share experiences? Because what we were not, it was not about country here. The idea was that a solution in West Africa is pretty much a solution in East Africa because common challenges definitely need common solutions. And this way we would then use the youth in Uganda who were developing solar dryers to train youth in Kenya, and the youth in Kenya later on train youth in Ghana and Nigeria and vice versa. And it's the same happening for briquettes and biofertilizer. And they are doing this using virtual space because they're tech savvy. They're using webinars to train one another. They're using emails to communicate. And because of the tech savviness of these young people, it's very easy for them to cross-hybridize lessons without necessarily having to fly from one country to another. And that way, we have actually seen this pick up very quickly. And one aspect to further buttress the question you asked is you do not have to work with everybody at the same time. You have to work with the willing. And I always say work with the willing, because what we have noticed is that if you have 2-3 willing youth who voluntarily volunteer their time to learn and perfect their skills, those who are not doing it because they think there is no money in it, they start to follow those ones once they see that they have developed a solution and they are standing out as a result of that solution. Then it becomes a pull factor for others to come on board. And that has worked. And I think those are very practical examples that definitely can also work very hugely in South Asia.
Excellent. Thank you very much. In fact, I am following your example now with this Gobeshona Conference, which, as you know, we used to do as a conference in Dhaka, Bangladesh. We would invite people to come, fly to Dhaka to participate. But now that we have gone virtual, we decided let's make it global and let us connect with each other. Like you are in Nairobi and I'm here in Dhaka. Right. Let us use this opportunity. And you are quite right. We see the same thing. The younger generation are far more tech savvy than we are. You know, I am, you know, I have to learn everything. They know it all. And so let us find a way to connect our youth program people from your side and our side. And also I want to invite you, which we'll follow up with you later, to get involved with the least developed countries universities consortium that we have set up, where we have a good strong student component in that. And I'm sure they would love to get to be involved with your program and become volunteers and trainers, even if they can acquire the knowledge and training. And I love the idea of couching it as training of trainers. The people, you are empowering people to do something, and then they do something and they become examples. And that's really the way to do it. I love that modality. I want to move on now a little bit to, I know you also engage with governments, with policymaking. You made a good point that every country has good policies. That's the same here, but then we don't implement them. And we fail to implement them. You know, that we have everything is on paper, it's fine. In practice, it isn't. So how do you try and overcome these bottlenecks, particularly with decision makers, policy makers in government? Not that they are bad, but they, you know, they have a blind spot. They may not recognize this. They may not think it's important. They may not see the opportunity. How do you convince them that this is something that they should be taking seriously and doing something about, not changing policy necessarily, but implementing policies that they may already have?
Yeah, thanks again, Salim. I really appreciate. I think that is a bottleneck generally across the world, and more so in developing and least developed countries. What I've learned over time is that sometimes great ideas and great concepts, as well as great proposals, mean quite very little to policymakers and politicians. And what seems to work very well is actually a practical solution that have already worked. They're more interested in, because they have challenges to address. They have jobs. They want to create jobs for their population, and especially for the young people. At the same time, they still need to create to ensure that the economy is functional. They still need to ensure. So when you look at all these challenges, most of the governments in Africa and also in least developing countries or developing countries do not leverage a coherent, integrated approach to solutions. But when you can be able to show it without belaboring them on the ground that this is what has happened and this is the impact, and if you were able to leverage on this, this is how you can create jobs for the youth. This is how you can address the health problems of ensuring that mothers are not inhaling smoke. This is how you can still keep your environment intact, and this is how you can still contribute to implementing your Paris Agreement and other status 3 agreement. That starts to create a groundswell of not only them coming on board, but they start to see that as an opportunity. This is what we did in Nigeria, for example, engaging the Ministry of Agriculture and Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Trade in a discussion on how environment and nature-based solutions can be integrated into their policy, at the top level was all agreeable, but the question was always, how do we do this? But when we now engage the youth on the ground to demonstrate that a simple solar dryer, which is a clean energy solution, can address an agricultural challenge of post-harvest losses, and in the course of doing that, create jobs for the youth, but also contribute to achieving the Ministry of Trade standard of ensuring that food, for example, cassava needs to be dry to a requisite moisture level, that was no longer news to them anymore. They came on board and they actually revised most of their policies to integrate this into. So what we have learned in a nutshell is that sometimes bottom-up impact is very, very powerful than sometimes top-down, and that the already existing policies needs now to be driven from an implementation perspective, and that is why engaging the young people to be part of really the drivers of policy implementation is, to me, the best solution to actually moving policy implementation forward.
Great, thank you very much. I love this bottom-up experiential knowledge, sharing solutions and showing them, not telling them, but showing them what can be done. But then I want to take it a step further, because again, in my experience, and I'm sure this may be the same with you, not all politicians, not all bureaucrats are the same. Some of them individually are more willing to listen. They will go and see your example. They will talk to the youth and they'll say, yeah, this is something useful, good. Let's see what we can do. So we need innovative individual politicians and bureaucrats whom we can then cultivate and work as and use as examples. And to me, that is an opportunity for the cross-country learning as well. So, if we could identify a set of these innovative government people, both at the political level, maybe local representatives or members of parliament or ministers even, and then also bureaucrats from the local to the national level who have taken a step out of the comfort zone and done something. As you said, they've supported activities that they feel is a useful thing to do. Let us find if we can, find a network of these individuals and make them more powerful and more collectively able to persuade others who may not be still convinced. They are allies that we need to be working with. Can you share some thoughts about that and how we might be able to do that?
Yeah, thanks again. I think that is very possible, and I think that has already started happening, because you can only work with what you have. And I've always said this, you cannot work with what you don't have, because it's only by using what you have that you can then achieve what you don't have. And already building on what works. The numbers never really bother me, whether they're 2, 3, 4, or 5. It's whether you do have what you have, then you work with it. When you look across the continent, there are those who are really willing. I actually believe everybody is willing. But the problem sometimes is that they have heard the same thing said over and over, so then they give up. That a good policy that will be devised, whether it's a climate smart agriculture policy, is going to reduce poverty and make sure that food insecurity is wiped out the next year and nothing happens, and then we keep doing that. But when you actually prove that it is working and they start to come on board, then you work with those ones. So what I think is that the examples, pockets of examples that we have had across the continent, we can then build on the policymakers and actors who have embraced this and are championing this within their different ministries to now become the showcase examples for others to follow. And we can do that building on what we've already done. But as we are doing that, we also build on these youth who have now become not only the training of trainers, but also champions in their own right to articulate the issues. And why am I saying this? In South Asia and in Bangladesh, I believe it's the same statistic like in Africa, where the youthful population actually are the higher percentage. That then means that they have to be listened to, and they are being listened to. If they champion these solutions, policymakers will listen to them, both from two perspectives. They need them for votes. Secondly, they campaign using slogans of creating jobs for the youth, but the youth here are the ones saying, we have done this, we need to bring this to impact. And the biggest tool of change driving is policy. So that then gets uptaked into policy, by default, not even again by convincing anymore, because it is the youth bringing what has worked and what has also contributed to developmental development. So I agree with you. That can be done building on what we have already achieved. And I think that we will do it at two-tier level. The youth level of policy implementation and the higher level of policy making, where, because what is very visible and effective across countries is that the policy making process is never absent and the policies are there. But what is absent is the policy implementation. So that gap from bottom up driving policy implementation needs to be another constituent of innovators, and those who are making the policy now, another constituent, but now merged together with the bottom and the top, and then we can have a very viable force that can be transformational to the entire world.
Great, thank you. I'm a great believer, as you know, in bottom-up meeting top-down and finding the connections. So let me switch a little bit away from the policymakers in the government to the finance sector. You mentioned this also in your presentation. And I feel one of the biggest opportunities in the finance sector, particularly the commercial finance, the bankers and investors, is that they are profit-oriented. So if you can show them a profit-making enterprise by your youth, then that should not take time to convince them. If it's going to make them money, they will invest in it. And so tell us a little bit about your experience in getting the financiers, the investors on board, and then also then becoming your champions as well.
Yeah, thanks again. I think that's very, very crucial now, especially the gap in financing is visible across the globe, where the developing countries need above 70 billion every year to implement adaptation as per the UNEP Adaptation Gap report. The idea is that, like I said earlier, innovations in financing cannot happen without taking into consideration the context of those who are already more vulnerable to the changing climate. And here we're talking about the informal sector, where they already have structures that have worked before and are still working now. The communal cooperative, they have different names in West Africa, we call it Jangis. In East Africa, they call it Chamas. I believe there is a name in Bangladesh for it, but I believe it's pretty much everywhere. And tapping on that and innovating around that becomes very important. And as you said, investors will invest, especially banks will invest where they will make profit. And that is why adaptation as an investment opportunity needs to be pitched from that dimension of them investing for a higher return on investment, and that the resilience is actually an offshot of a co-benefit, because to them, they don't really bother much about that. And if you take, for example, just the solar dryer that I explained, that helps to reduce post-harvest losses, that put money in more pockets. That then means that if a bank was investing through a local cooperative, and I will explain why through a local cooperative later, to ensure that youth can then be able to fabricate solar dryers, those are capital assets, and actually they are addressing a problem which is reversing post-harvest losses. It means that their money is safe from the perspective of they can take away the capital assets if there is a default, but at the same time, because there is a challenge that is visible to be addressed post-harvest losses, it means that when whatever thing is dry by the community, it gets sold, it doesn't get spoiled. So their paying back potential and ability is higher. But they cannot do that directly with the farmers. They must use structures to ensure accountability and traceability. And the only structures that you can use that are dealing with financing using contextual realities are cooperatives. And this is something that have not been exploited. And that's why you see me pushing it very strongly, because if you take, for example, Kenya here, you go to Samburu or to Turkana, most of the communities there do not have access to the banking sector that we are used to. Most of them don't even have cell phones to even access M-Pesa. But they have, in one way or the other, community groups that they belong to. To what extent do you leverage those community groups as your entry point so that you have access to more people, but also can ensure traceability of the actions as well as accountability for your resources and a return on your investment without necessarily having to be labeled? So the point is we build on already proven structures that have worked, but at the same time, reorientating the business model to be about investment opportunities rather than the traditional socially led dimension of action that have happened for quite a very long time.
Great, thank you. Richard, we are coming towards the end. So let me, before we end, change the subject a little bit and ask you a personal question. I know that you love to cite African proverbs. In fact, you started this presentation with a very nice one on where there are experts, there will be learning. Where do you get these from? Did you get them from your parents, or do you read? What are the sources? I love your African proverbs.
Yeah, thank you very much, Salim. I grew up in a small village in the northwestern part of Cameroon called Jinquing. And one of the lessons that I learned growing up when we were still young, we used to gather around the fireside. And we will be told stories by our parents of things that happened in the past. And most of those stories center around the cultural fabric of our society. And one of the aspects was the proverbs where we were taught how to recite them sometimes. They were pregnant with meaning in that they will use very few words to pass a very heavy message. And that inspired us. But why I use them today is not just because of that, is that sometimes context is very important. Even in the same country, communities are not the same. And even in the same community, the small villages are not the same. That then means that if we do not contextualize solutions, and I really like the way you put locally led adaptation in this conference. Locally led means what happens maybe in northern or southern Bangladesh might not be the same in central or in west or east, but the principles remain the same, but the contextual reality differs. So using the African proverb sometimes contextualize the solutions. For example, when there is one that if you close your eyes to facts, you will learn through accidents. And what does that mean if we're talking climate change? If you do not see what is happening as something, then definitely you will only notice it when you are in a worse situation than what you are seeing, which is just a snapshot of it. So that's why I use it mostly to contextualize, but it's also part of our cultural upbringing where our parents were using a lot of this to pass a big message in very few words without belaboring the point.
Great. Thank you very much, Richard. I want to thank you really from the bottom of my heart for giving the time and sharing your insights and experience, very valuable experience with us. Before we close, let me just make a few concluding remarks from my side. Firstly, I will follow up with you on some of the ways that we discussed what we might be able to collaborate. Once the COVID-19 situation improves and traveling becomes possible again, I invite you to come visit us in Bangladesh. We'd love to have you come here. And I look forward to visiting you again in Nairobi. I haven't been to Nairobi for a long time. I hope to be able to go again soon. And also to think about next year's Gobeshona Conference. You know, a year from now, January 2022, we will do it again as a global conference, an online global conference. And I invite you to think about involving more of your partners and youth and finding ways in which we can make that even more interactive, sharing knowledge across the continents as we go forward. So not just, you know, go back home and wait for another year, but let us proactively do some planning, some designing, some involving our different partners and youths, both at the government side, in the youth side, in the finance side, and see if we can build this network out of people who are doing things. The principle, I think, I like yours, is solution oriented. You know, we pick people who are doing things. We don't talk about the problem. We talk about solutions. And we find people who are actively involved in finding solutions and then helping them and enabling them to network and facilitating their success in the solutions that they are doing. And so if we can build up this bottom-up oriented network, and this is my ambition for doing this Gobeshona conference as a global conference, is connecting local efforts that are taking place in different places, as you said, contextualize, but then there's also something common. The problem they may be addressing, in your case, cassava, drying cassava and dealing with post-harvest losses is common in all the countries that do cassava. Similarly, there will be common problems that are faced in different countries where people are doing something to solve the problem that will resonate with other groups who are facing a similar problem in perhaps a completely different country or even a completely different continent. Let us find those cases. Let us find the bridges between the local actors that are taking place, that are addressing a problem, and then connect them. And the way to do this is not through the problem, but through the solution to the problem. Let us find people who are working on solutions and then connect them to learn from each other. One of them may be doing it one way, another one might be doing it slightly differently, and they can learn from each other a better way to both of them to improve. So that really is the premise behind us making the Gobeshona Conference from this year into a global conference. We'll remain global, even if, from next year onward, travel is permitted. We're not making it a physical conference anymore. We're going to stay global. We're going to stay virtual. And we want to use this annual event to connect local efforts around the world, in Africa, in Asia, in America, in Europe, in Australia. It's happening everywhere. And in fact, when we decided to make this into a global conference, I reached out to friends around the world. I got an overwhelming response from all over the world. People saying, yeah, we'll do a session in Australia. We'll do a session in America. It's happening there. Okay, so good, let's have all these different sessions, but then we need to connect the dots. The next phase is to connect them. And I want you and me to be our Africa and Asia connectors in this, with the solution-oriented, bottom-up, youth-oriented approach to finding solutions. So let me give you the last word to share your final thoughts for us, Richard.
Yeah, thanks very much, Salim, for that beautiful summary. I think you have actually put everything in perspective, and especially the aspect you've mentioned, connecting local efforts around the world. I think that is actually not just the best strategy to drive adaptation and build resilience of communities, but it's also to start bringing like-minded people together around a common solution to a common problem, which is climate change. But more importantly, what I have noticed in the course of the work that we do is that sometimes the challenges overwhelm us more than the solutions. But focusing on the solutions can actually solve the very challenges that overwhelm us more. With us talking about the challenges, debating about the challenges, rather than discussing the solutions and looking at how we can take them forward. So the point is, let us focus on our strengths rather than our weaknesses, because focusing on strengths inspired and empowers. Focusing on weaknesses and talking weaknesses and problems actually drains and disempower and dissuade and demotivate. That's my last word.
I love that, Richard. I'm a great follower of your wise words. Thank you very much, and we will carry on this conversation in future.
Indeed.